Hey folks, I'm Anton, co-founder and CEO of Keyboard Cats Studio. Today, based on a request from a friend, I would like to talk about how we set up our development. To preface this, um, project management is a very, very complicated topic. I am nowhere near a specialist. In fact, people have been working for decades to figure this out, have been turning this into an industry on its own. So everything I say right now works for us, might not work for you. So take this more of an inspiration rather than a recipe for success. To begin, I should probably talk about how projects generally work in games industry. Roughly, when you are creating a single player game for um, multiplayer games and for games as a service, things are somewhat different. You start with conception, which is part of the project where you formulate the idea and maybe some narrative, and you create your pitch to whatever publisher you're working with or to C-suite of the studio. Um, After that, if everything goes fine, you're moving into pre-production where you're usually creating a slice of the game, and it's different for different genres. Often it is something called first playable, where you have all the game mechanics and benchmarks for your visuals and a couple of levels or some segment of a world if it's an open world game that proves that the game is fun and it's doable and everything's gonna work out while not having to involve hundreds and hundreds of people um, before it is necessary to reduce costs, basically. It doesn't work like that in practice for all publishers. Often, especially with serialized titles, you have teams transitioning over almost in their totality from one franchise game to another, but that's the rough plan. After pre-production, you go into production where you have the entire team focus on finalizing all the game mechanics, bringing them up to necessary quality, building out all the assets or the levels, everything. And then usually there's an alpha period where you maybe have a public playtest or something. At this point, most of the content is in there, and you're starting to balance the game, um, and you're starting to triage all the bugs. And then there's the release, or sometimes it's called finaling, where your team is laser focused on squashing all the bugs that you can, finalizing all the TRCs if you're working on a console game. If you have DLCs, that's about the time when you're gonna start producing content for the DLCs, and right after you're releasing the game, the DLC is gonna go into the finaling stage. Um, for indie games, the process gets a lot more muddled because a lot of the rationale for this is basically to save costs on a large team. And if you have a small team where the overlaps are non existent, um, your phases are going to bleed into one another and you're going to have to make concessions. Um, so Our particular flow is also influenced by our conditions. We are a fully remote studio, which means that we cannot have um, very short feedback cycles. Um, we have a team of experienced people, which means that we can afford a high degree of autonomy. Um, I do not need to keep track of designers or our second programmer because they're completely autonomous. They know what they're doing. We still sync regularly, but this is more of a way to keep everybody on the same page and increase the bounce factor just in case something happens. The other unique thing that we have is that we are a part-time development studio right now. Everybody has a full-time day job, and we are working with an expectation that we are putting in somewhere between 10 and 15 hours per week, which means that our work is highly asynchronous, and it is important to be very good at synchronizing and talking. But on the flip side, this allows us to not deal with publishers, which gives us a few perks. For example, we don't need to prepare pitch decks. We don't need to deal with milestones. We don't need to deal with cancellations. This is particularly important this year since economy is generally not in a great place, and it has affected a lot of studios and a lot of projects that were to be funded. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do, and the first thing that we basically did, was to establish project pillars. For us, it took about 2 to 3 days of workshopping to figure out a set of guidelines of what our game is about and what our game is not about. I would recommend it to be in person if at all possible. You are likely gonna need to be somewhere in one place to form a company, an LLC or your local equivalent, and I would suggest extending your stay and spending this time being in a room together, working through ideas. It really goes much faster with physical props. If you cannot do that, set aside a couple of full days, send your kids to grandma, stock up on Chinese food, and just work through it. After this process, you will hopefully have a list of pillars which will guide your design process. We have 5, somewhere between 3 and 10 is generally a good number. You don't have to have everything figured out, but at least you're gonna narrow down the design scope. Important part in all of this, and something that we learned the hard way, write down everything in painful details, especially if you have people from different cultures. Some things are assumed and they are very, very different based on people, based on culture, based on region. We have 2 people from Taiwan, 1 person from Ukraine, 1 person from Moldova, and 1 person from Romania on our team. Cultural expectations are super different. It took us a long time to get used to everything. And also, even without cultural differences, personal expectations and personal assumptions are very, very different. So write everything down in painful details, because otherwise you're gonna spend a lot of time redoing work. Okay, so once you're done with that, you probably want to set up a weekly routine. What we did is we have set up an hourly sync meeting each week where we go through what people did that week, and we figure out a path to our next logical milestone. So, for example, right now we're working our way to our first playable full gameplay prototype. Nowadays, our weekly sync might look something like this. Programmers present the mechanics that they have implemented over the last week. Our 3D artist might show off new assets. Our concept artist might show off some mood boards that she has prepared to define the art style. And our designer might show off the latest balancing or a design document describing the mechanics that we still need to implement. If somebody can't make it to this meeting, it's not the end of the world. There is Slack, Discord, whatever text means of communication that you use. As long as you keep in touch, everything should be good. Another important part of weekly syncs is scoping down your expectations correctly before your next project milestone. Even though we do not have hard milestones that you might expect when working with a publisher, where you need to deliver a certain set of features to get the next milestone payment, we still set ourselves certain goals and certain dates. They might not necessarily be hard dates, but it gives us the ability to see what we can do and what we need to cut to keep realistic. Otherwise, you end up in a state of horrible feature creep and you never get anywhere. To do this, we use Trello, but you can use any project management software that you like. Jira, Notion, whatever you might have laying around. And we usually like to check at the end of each weekly sync meeting what is still left. Do we still need something added to have a set of features or the state of the projects that we want before the milestone? Do we want to scope something down? After the weekly sync is done and after everybody knows what they're going to be working on for the next week or two, people often break off and set up separate calls whenever they have the time to discuss more localized topics that don't need involvement from everybody on the team. That's usually designed for particular features, art direction, conversations, things of those natures. The other large format of synchronizations that we use is workshops. For cases where an hour is not enough, and for cases where we want everybody to be on board, we might set aside 2-3 hours over the weekend to discuss and gather feedback. For example, our latest one was about defining thematics that we are going to develop art style for over the next 6 to 9 months, which is a major decision that is going to lock us into a certain path. These workshops are not frequent, so they should not be a significant overhead for your team. If you find yourself continuously in meetings discussing minute details, you might want to rethink your position on delegation. With this style of work, you need to be okay with accepting decisions that other people have made, even if they are not the decisions that you necessarily would have made. And this is a challenging thing. I personally struggle with it. I hope I'm getting better, but a lot of people like to give feedback and tweak, and that might be counterproductive with this particular work setup. All of this being said, we are currently in a very generative state of the project, and as we move into production and even more so into release mode, we are probably gonna get more structured and keep track of things tighter, just to be able to make sure that we deliver the quality that we want and that the players expect of modern games. So all of this will change, and that is likely a good thing. Your project management should change to adapt to the situation, and you should introduce those changes gradually in order to prepare your team to sort of shift the mindset. This is the way that we run our team. How do you run yours? Leave your comments below, like and subscribe, and see you in the next video.